Мобильные гуманитарии.
Global aid industry.
Widersprüche des Humanitarismus.
Podrían informar al humanitarismo.
Notion de distance, de proximité et de l'autre.
Welcome to the Mobile Humanitarian webinar series. My name is Tilma Stavlansky. I'm an anthropologist at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. In this series, we're exploring the relationship between humanitarianism and mobility. We're looking at the movement of people, ideas, and things from local settings to international organizations.
So today's speaker is Kevin O'Sullivan, who is a historian at the National University of Ireland, Galway. He is author of 2 books, the most recent of which is here, The NGO Moment, The Globalisation of Compassion from Biafra to Live Aid, which is fantastic, and I recommend everyone goes out and buy it. It's one of those rare Cambridge books, which is also at an affordable price point. So another thing to recommend it. Kevin's also the author of several influential articles in journals, including Past and Present, the Journal of Genocide Research, and the Journal of Global History. His work is notable for going beyond aid planning to examine how delivery actually worked on the ground. I personally think he's among the most innovative historians working in this field, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome him to the Mobile Humanitarians webinar series.
Oh, thanks so much. It's the nicest introduction I think I've ever had. Yeah, I mean, and it's really delight. I mean, this is such a brilliant series to be part of. I mean, innovative is the word I thought of when you invited me, and it's such a terrific opportunity to talk a little bit more about my work. I suppose just by way of very brief introduction, this comes from the book that Agnieszka really pleasantly held up. It's nice to see a hard copy made all its way all around the world. Is the kind of root of this project, which was started about 10 years ago in the University of Birmingham, where I was a postdoc, and was an attempt to look at how the West encountered the global South through NGOs. So this paper is a discussion of one element of that, which I came to relatively late in the project, and it's about how aid workers themselves help to shape that community. And the title of the paper is Building Aidland, because I do borrow a little bit from anthropology, as you'll see in the paper.
I want to start this talk by painting a picture for you of life in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, in the last quarter of 1972. The context is a new country in the middle of a massive rebuilding project. 2 years before, a devastating cyclone had caused the deaths of approximately 500,000 people in the Bengal Delta. It was followed by a period of brutal conflict, which began in March 1971 and led to thousands being killed, made over 9 million people refugees, and ended with the transformation of East Pakistan into the independent state of Bangladesh. Now, at the end of 1972, Dhaka was thronged with aid agencies and aid workers intent on aiding in the construction of the new state. Their days were spent designing projects, scoping out locations, and vying to win the new administration's approval for their operations. In the evenings, they gathered to make sense of what they had witnessed and to reminisce about earlier escapades. The locals, however, were less than convinced of the value of their presence. Nicholas Samstag, reporting for the London Times newspaper in December 1972, describes a deep skepticism towards the new arrivals. The aid people, he wrote, those that are aid people, work pretty hard in their provincial fields and paddies, and when they get back to their villas in the upper middle class suburb of Danmondi, where a certain elite used to live before the War of Liberation exterminated or displaced them, they tend to sit around a lot, or, which is worse, talk about the scarcity of drink in a puritanical Muslim society. And when they've had enough to drink or become morose enough because they haven't, perhaps they will begin to talk about the increasing evidence that they shouldn't be there at all. The presence of thousands of outsiders in South Asia, each acting on an impulse to help, was hardly unique to the early 1970s. Missionaries, colonial officials, charitable volunteers, and later health workers and development administrators had long been associated with welfare provision in this region. Yet the sense of collective endeavour that Nicholas Samstag described in Dhaka did mark a significant new departure for the aid sector. The crisis in South Asia came at an important juncture of what I've called the NGO moment, the period between the world's first televised famine in Biafra in the late 1960s and the high point of populist humanitarianism in the Horn of Africa a decade and a half later. In that short period, NGOs developed from organizations on the margins of international politics to central manifestations of Western concern for the less well-off in the world. And aid workers are on the front line of this NGO moment. The places they worked, slept, played, the locations where ideas about doing aid were exchanged, and the sense of collective belonging they fostered put into practice the ideals on which global humanitarianism, aid and development were made. The process of enacting those principles in turn shaped the sector's identity, not least by helping to define transnational activism by what it wasn't. As Nicholas Samstag's scathing criticism suggests to us, the good intentions of aid workers proved too little to overcome the hierarchies between donors and recipients, or to translate aid into solidarity with local communities. This talk, which draws from my book about the NGO moment, as well as a piece that I've written for the European Review of History about South Asia in the early 1970s, uses Bangladesh as a case study to describe the everyday experiences of aid workers and the aid industry they created. In doing so, I also draw on the concept that ethnographers call Aidland, the mix of volunteers, experts, and aid professionals that make up the aid community, the physical and intellectual contexts in which they operated, and their impact on the localities in which they operated. I've divided my talk into 4 parts, and each one corresponds to a significant claim that I want to make about how the South Asian crisis helps us to understand the modern humanitarian industry and the nature of aid. So the first argument I want to make is for viewing this NGO moment as a period of acceleration for the sector, in which its activities radically diversified, while simultaneously carrying with them the baggage of what had come before. The second argument is to show that while there were certain characteristics that were common to aid workers in every environment, we need to be very careful not to lose sight of the specific contextual factors and points of reference on which humanitarian responses were based. Understanding that complexity then and the consequences of it provides the basis for my third claim that I want to make today. By laying bare the processes through which Aidland was constructed in South Asia, we can test how the community imagined and reinforced particular roles for itself, often paternalistic, in the third world. And I use that term, by the way, because it was the way that this location was imagined at the time. So they didn't really use the term the Global South until later in the 20th century. Finally, I want to describe the kind of solidarity that Aidland produced, one in which was a more complex set of entanglements than the plea to common humanity that was used as a calling card by many NGOs. Solidarity in Aidland excluded those on the receiving end of outside intervention almost as often as it embraced them, in other words. So, the birth of the community. Between the late 1960s and the mid-1980s, humanitarian aid and development NGOs became the primary conduits of Western compassion for the global poor. This is a period of profound change for the West's relationship with the third world. The world's first televised famine in Biafra precipitated a dramatic spike in the number of new NGOs founded around the world. Financial gains followed. In Britain, for example, if we look at this period, the combined revenue of the sector's largest humanitarian aid and development NGOs increased 5-fold. By the time fundraising for Ethiopia reached its peak with Live Aid in July 1985, NGOs had become the symbol of and principal channel for public and state interventions in the third world. This transformation is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, we take it for granted now not only that we should care about poverty and suffering anywhere in the world, but that NGOs can and should intervene to do something about it. Yet that kind of an assumption would not have come naturally to the sector's supporters, never mind the wider public, as recently as the mid-1960s. The concept of development aid to poor but independent countries, as opposed to assistance to colonial dependencies, is a relatively new one, and its scope is still far from being understood and agreed upon. Christian aid, which is the official aid agency of the British Protestant churches, told its supporters in 1966. Yet within 2 decades, the sector had transitioned from that rather patronizing label of charities or voluntary agencies to being thought as reliable, expert providers of aid and compassion. The crisis in South Asia was central to this NGO moment. In November 1970, a devastating cyclone struck East Pakistan, destroying infrastructure, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of Bengalis, and in the process drawing international aid agencies into a massive humanitarian relief campaign. The return of NGOs to the region the following March to provide for the approximately 9.5 million people made refugees by the brutal war that eventually created Bangladesh gave further momentum to the sector's transformation into a permanent fixture in the provision of aid. And in this image you can see on the screen, these are the refugee camps dotted around the border with India, between East Pakistan, or what became Bangladesh, and India. An outbreak of cholera in early June 1971 focused international attention on the difficult conditions faced by Bengalis in the refugee camps in northern India. The UNHCR entered the region later that month, followed by the opening of a United Nations Pakistan Relief Operation, UNIPRO, office in Dhaka. NGOs also began making plans to intervene through fundraising campaigns that paid for supplies and aid workers to be transported to South Asia. And so in June and July 1971, for example, the British NGOs Warn Want, Oxfam and Save the Children sent medical teams to the region, while Christian Aid channeled its support through the World Council of Churches. In Canada, Oxfam Canada led the specially formed Combined Appeal for Pakistan Relief and sent its own representatives to South Asia. Further volunteers followed from the West, including a group of Irish doctors and nurses sponsored by the main Irish NGO Concern. The activities of these individuals helped to establish the broad contours of the spaces of social experience and concrete political engagement that NGOs would inhabit. But it was the move to newly independent Bangladesh in early 1972 that secured a long-term role for the sector. Where emergency relief had given aid workers direction, rehabilitation and development, and this is crucial, allowed them to put down roots. And this is where we get the emergence of this modern aid industry. Within just a few months of independence, the new state was awash with NGO projects, covering everything from basic health provision to adult education and technical assistance. The number of foreign aid workers that arrived in Bangladesh is actually quite difficult to calculate. At any one time, each NGO might have had a field director, some small groups of aid workers in the region, augmented by visiting officials from home, as well as local staff and volunteers. But the scale of their impact is very easy to discern. And here's how we do it. Not only had house prices skyrocketed in Dhaka by the mid-1970s, but traffic conditions had also significantly worsened. The result, no doubt, of all those foreigners traversing the city on rickshaws. I think the best way to analyze this influx is as a reconfiguration of Western intervention in this region. In the most basic sense, the arrival of dozens of foreign aid workers, first in India to deal with the refugee camps and subsequently moving to Bangladesh, brought those individuals into contact with local communities in the towns, villages and cities where they lived, and in the camps, clinics and myriad other spaces where aid was delivered. Those encounters were in turn mediated through the infrastructure that NGOs demanded to facilitate their presence. So we're talking here about the cars, jeeps, trucks, rickshaws that provided transport, the houses, apartments, hotels required for accommodation and administration, crucially, and a variety of buildings, both temporary and permanent, that provided the basis from which aid could be distributed. To borrow a phrase from Lisa Smirl's fantastic book, Spaces of Aid, this landscape of aid sat on the foundation of centuries of European and North American inhabitation of the region. In the early 1970s, however, it became the bedrock on which the contours of the aid industry were constructed. And I just want to describe this in terms of 3 overlapping spaces: workspaces, administrative spaces, and social spaces that the aid workers actually occupied. Now, most of their time is spent in work environments, obviously. And in India, this meant the system of camps established by the local authorities to deal with the influx of refugees. The teams of volunteers, for example, and mainly medics that arrived in June 1971, operated in that variety of locations that we saw on the previous map, near the border between India and Pakistan. But while they inhabit the camps during the day, they leave during the night. And in the cities, a parallel infrastructure emerges, both for administration and for socializing. Offices were opened, meeting spaces were established, and living quarters were repurposed to provide for the flow of information and instruction about the crisis. It's in these spaces that formal networks of aid workers begin to emerge. So in Calcutta, for example, NGOs clustered together in areas close to local and international decision makers. Here, Google Maps is my friend, because here you can see where Oxfam kept its office, in the newly opened Kenilworth Hotel, where its team also slept in, as they described it, modest comfort and reasonable air conditioning. Personnel from 2 other British NGOs, Save the Children and War and Want, were also based in the hotel, while the local Caritas agency ran an office across the landing from Oxfam, and another local partner, Cathedral Relief Services, was across the street. The sense of community this situation generated was strengthened by their close proximity to government and diplomatic circles. So the route that I've marked out here is to the British High Commission's offices, which are just around the corner from the hotel, a short walk away. And the hotel's location also gave the NGOs access to the nascent Bangladeshi administration in exile. Oxfam's Julian Francis, whose apartment on Auckland Square was 5 minutes in the other direction, remembered walking a similar distance to drop into tea at the Theatre Road office of Bangladeshi Prime Minister Tajuddin Ahmed. The transitory nature of this infrastructure, so Oxfam never actually sought out alternative office accommodation, despite the considerable expense of staying at this brand new Kenilworth Hotel, was replaced by something more durable in Bangladesh. The arrival en masse of so many foreign aid workers and officials in early 1972 transformed Dhaka and its surrounding regions. One commentator actually calls it a race in charity, the desire to spend money for the sake of it. And the variety of projects that NGOs sponsored, their diverse locations, made their presence appear also pervasive. These developments don't go unnoticed by the local population, as we saw at the start of this talk, nor are they entirely welcomed. Deep frustrations emerge as a result of the divisions that this Aidland fostered between aid workers and the local communities they lived and worked in. And it hardly matters here that most aid workers lived in accommodation, apart from Oxfam in the Kenilworth Hotel, that was far from luxurious by Western standards. So the Irish NGO Concern, for example, encouraged its volunteers to adopt a communal approach to living, sharing clothes, allowing out-of-city visitors to take their beds, and eating together every evening. Of much greater significance was the sense of dislocation these patterns of work, sleep, and socializing engendered. The fact that their presence was, by its very nature, a short-term experience, not only led aid workers to fall back on pre-established and often colonial or neo-colonial networks, it also reinforced the liminality that characterized their presence in the field. Nor was this more in evidence than in those socializing patterns. As I said, they echo their colonial predecessors by new aid worker arrivals plugging immediately into pre-existing networks, mainly those established by NGOs they worked for or traveled with. And they fell under the direction of and learned their social habits from those already in residence in India and Pakistan, or in East Pakistan, Bangladesh. Some occasions, and a great example of this is the Nigerian evenings that were attended by veterans of the Biafran crisis in Dhaka, were inherently international in character. Others were the product of circumstance. So residents and visitors to the concern houses in Bangladesh entertained themselves with, and I quote from them, simple, frugal entertainments, Scrabble, the inevitable guitars, as well as occasional amorous liaisons. Socializing also sometimes was organized according to faith, and national identity too mattered to how aid workers connected and who with. So Irish aid workers, for example, retained a strong sense of nationality, including marking their first St. Patrick's Day in Dhaka on the 17th of March 1972 with a program of traditional dancing and what they call national songs. I'm not really sure what they are. That is not to suggest that the divisions between locals and foreign aid workers were entirely rigid. Not all aid workers lived, worked, or socialized in the same way, and some of them even deliberately sought out new experiences. In the quarter century after its program began in Bangladesh, for example, 5 concerned volunteers married local men. And likewise, we should be very wary about erasing the agency of local actors in defining the boundaries of this aid landscape. Where and how Western aid workers could operate were questions frequently decided by local authorities. The overriding image, however, is of a community apart, both in physical and figurative terms. To quote John Heathershaw, the aid community was neither local nor global, neither fully qualified nor properly equipped. It creates professionals on the margins, both national and expatriate. So these spaces of social experience and concrete political engagement imposed their own logic on the aid sector. But the community was constituted on something more than these physical spaces. Woven into the parochial cosmopolitanism that aid workers cultivated were certain ideas about the theory and practice of giving aid. They were rooted in past experiences and in ideas accumulated in more formal educational settings. But knowledge about aid in this period is also quite performative. It's driven by cognitive and practical shifts that responded to the context in which aid was practiced. So what does this mean in the case of India and Bangladesh? Well, the aid community was far from united in how it understood the crisis and the process of giving aid. Aid workers were missionaries, medical doctors, engineers, volunteers, former army officers, colonial officials, each with varying degrees of expertise of working in this region or the wider third world and or with poorer communities. What unifies the sector, however, is a common understanding of the ideological underpinnings of what aid is for and how it should be conducted. And this is particularly visible in the emphasis they placed on the primacy of expertise. The answer of what constitutes this expert knowledge is very easily discernible. It's the rationalized, measurable, standardized interventions that constituted what scholars like Tom Scott-Smith and Joel Glassman have come to describe as humanitarian modernity. The guiding principles of international initiatives, like the first UN development decade in the 1960s, stress the importance of science in overcoming traditional practices, as they call them, and building a bright, brave new future beyond poverty and need. The growing number of aid workers with qualifications in the nascent academic discipline of development studies strengthens this impact still further. So to just give you one example, Father Angus Finucane, who was a member of the Catholic Holy Ghost Missionary Order, a veteran of Biafra, and became Concern's second field director in Bangladesh, and later actually its chief executive, won scholarships to Swansea University and St. Francis Xavier's University in Nova Scotia in Canada in the 1960s, before he applied that knowledge to the field. There are some tensions about what constituted expertise within those boundaries. And they're often redrawn when faced with the practical realities of delivering aid, however. So Oxfam, for example, tested amphicats, butyl septic tanks, water purifying units, inflatable warehouses, plastic insecticide sprayers in the region. And theirs is not the only such operation in Calcutta to rely on these tools of humanitarian modernity. Save the Children, for example, also dispatched considerable quantities of cholera vaccine and used newly invented high-speed jet injectors. So this is what this image portrays on your screen in the camps in June 1971. The fact that many of these technologies break down or prove unsuitable for the difficult conditions in which they're employed mattered less than the desire they fulfilled. What does this tell us about the community of aid workers that emerged in South Asia? Well, I think it tells us two things. The first, that while differences existed on what constituted best practice, distance from home and the fact of having to go through these practices reinforced a sense of common endeavor. So aid workers frequently privileged knowledge accumulated through practice and on-the-ground intelligence over instructions sent from headquarters. Second, and more significantly, ownership of expert knowledge was used to exclude those deemed not to belong to the aid community. Embedding expertise in the hierarchy of tasks associated with aid work, even the simple action of injecting people with cholera vaccine, served to distance the inhabitants of Aidland from the local population. That conclusion, which is later reinforced in crises in the Sahel, Cambodia, Central America, Ethiopia, and then in the 1990s in Somalia, Rwanda, and the Balkans, was rooted in the imagined spaces of belonging and solidarity that emerged among aid workers in the NGO moment. The sense of collective identity that existed in South Asia and the continuity of relationships that the crisis generated, most notably among Biafra veterans, underlined the feeling of an aid community in the middle of a significant transformation. This new humanitarian imaginary, as I'd like to call it, was founded on the values that aid workers carried with them to South Asia. And these are often individuals. They might be Christian, they might be activists, or they might be charitable motives. But the overarching narrative here is a commitment to saving and using expert knowledge to achieve it. Now, these are not new ideas, but what's different about this is the manner in which these communities become liminal. They become dislocated, but also connected to home. And the values that are transmitted to home through fundraising imperatives help to reinforce the sense of community, but also the sense of dislocation from the local context in which they work. The degree to which this imagined world conflicted with the lived reality of aid giving is really striking. Not only did it tend to erase the political, social, and economic realities in which aid workers operated, it also reduced the work of those individuals to a set of easily recognizable characteristics. Those traits became as much a part of the aid community's identity as the labels they granted themselves. And so this example here of Ernest Hillen, a Winnipeg Free Press journalist who visited Camp Banipur, 31 miles northeast of Calcutta in July 1971, is a very good description of the manner in which he elevates an Oxfam Canada aid worker, Raymond Cronoye, to the position of saviour. And so this is the complex entanglement that we see between professional identities, on-the-ground experiences, and fundraising imperatives that shape the aid community's sense of collective belonging in the third world. The valorization of aid reduced humanitarianism to the act of saving those imperiled by these conditions, and Western aid workers became the ones best placed to undertake it. The marginalization of Indian and Bangladeshi staff and volunteers from the popular narrative of aid served a similar purpose. At the height of the crisis in South Asia, War and Want employed 400 Bengali and Indian staff, while Concern, Christian Aid, and the various faith-based organizations also worked closely with local actors, including Caritas India and the Christian Agency for Social Action. Oxfam and Oxfam Canada drew similarly on local help, including more than 200 student doctors who delivered medical relief. But when those Asian voices appeared in NGO narratives, their presence served only to reinforce the superiority of the knowledge of expatriate aid workers as experts and technicians, there to provide training and guidance. In our book, Spaces of Aid, which came out in 2015 posthumously, the late Lisa Smurl described an aid landscape that was in constant reconstruction and rebuilding, reliant on aid workers and their voyages to sustain itself. The story of how Aidland was constituted in South Asia provides us with a glimpse of that world in formation. The aid community's spaces of social experience and concrete political engagement provided the most visible manifestation of its presence and of the permanence to which many in the sector aspired. The aid community that emerged from the crisis was notably international in its outlook. And so many of the individuals we've described who found their feet in Biafra and Bangladesh went on to become leaders in an increasingly interconnected global network of aid agencies and NGOs. There's still much to learn about this historical experience of aid work, individual and collective, and what it can tell us about the global North's relationship with the post-colonial world. But I think if we place these individuals, rather than the organizations they worked for, at the center of these narratives, we can render visible not only the novelty of their actions, but also the deep-rooted and often hidden in plain sight legacies on which they were constructed. And in so doing, and I'll leave you with this, we can better appreciate how these complex entanglements constituted, or more accurately, actually reconstituted, the meanings of Europe, the third world, and the global in the late 20th century.
All right, Kevin, that is an excellent paper, very well delivered. I was just wondering, I'm fascinated by the idea of a cohort of Western aid workers who are sort of defined by their mobility in a sense, and as you point out, also liminality. I think it's so important, as you note in the talk, that aid workers actually knew each other from different contexts, and it's that movement that really binds them. So that, for example, in this case of Bangladesh in the early 1970s, some aid workers knew each other from Biafra in the late 60s. What role do you think is played by this hypermobility? Do you think that it served to separate aid workers from locals, or sort of non-Western aid workers, or does it function in a different way? You know, how would you characterize it?
I think you've kind of hit on the reason why I liked this case study actually, because I mean, Bertrand Tate has done brilliant work on Cambodia in the early 1980s. I'd highly recommend that. A really brilliant piece for the European Review of History, or your contemporary European history. I think it's in a few years ago, and that kind of sparked something in me where I'd read a lot and I'd spoken to a few people who'd worked in Bangladesh, and it is that sense of a community coming together or beginning to coagulate in the way that you're describing, and beginning to take on those traits of liminality, of, you know, I mean, I've borrowed a lot of some of the phrasing in the paper from the brilliant anthropology that's been done on ethnography of this Aidland concept, and there are a few phrases that liminal space is really important. The idea of a kind of a parochial cosmopolitanism, and in all those you're getting the feeling of this kind of separateness. Now, there's two ways to answer your question. One is, I think they're coming from different backgrounds and finding themselves put into a different location where they are kind of finding that alliance among themselves. I mean, Biafra is really important. I mean, the reference I made to the Nigeria nights where they all meet together is in a footnote to Ian Smiley's book. And it's way, I can't even remember how I found this footnote, but it's dug way down, and he mentions that he was there. He had been in Biafra, and there were a lot of other of them. And I felt in that what you can sense is that mobility is beginning to create that community by just that simple idea of sitting down together. Now, I just couldn't find out anything more about what they were doing, or, you know, how much they were drinking, or whether they were drinking at all, or what kind of a meeting it was. But then you have the other kind of communities, which I think are also there. There's the transition for the missionaries too. I think that's actually really important, that there are, you know, there are Canadian Raymond Cornoye, who I mentioned in the paper. He's a former missionary from that region, now moving into development. They're all being, and the Irish concern is a very much a kind of a missionary based kind of a transition from that old world to this new world of development. And I think that they're finding connections as well among their own communities and then outwards. I think there are two things that kind of help that, and I mentioned them in the paper. One is the fact that they are kind of in transition in the spaces that they live. So they only work in the camps until a certain time of day, and then they have to move out in the evenings. And that in India in 71. And you can see in that quote that I started the paper with that the same thing happens in Bangladesh. They're coming home in the evenings to these places. And I think that's actually really important, because it is actually separating them from the locals, and it's creating their sense of community. There's two more things I think are important here, just to contextualize that. One is, as I say, I think they're also mapping onto pre-existing networks. Now, I'm very hesitant to say directly onto colonial networks, but I think they are moving into spaces which they're not inventing those spaces completely. So I think that helps them, and it helps that separateness, that, you know, Oxfam sets up an office in this brand new hotel, you know, around the corner from the British representatives and British diplomats. I mean, I have, Google Maps has become such a historian's friend, because you can figure out how long it took somebody to walk somewhere. And the fact that Kenilworth Hotel still exists was really helpful. And the second thing is just that reinforces this is how they talk about local volunteers and local aid workers that work with them. They're just excluded generally from the narrative. Now, they're mentioned in a very specific way, which is, you know, as there's their definite hierarchy in how, you know, how they relate to, you know, the kind of the experts from the West, you know, who come into this location, even though most of them are trainee doctors, you know, and there is, I mean, this is the thing I I found out is that they are often as separate from this location because they don't speak Bengali. So they are also separate from this region and they don't have the connection to it. Yet they're seen as kind of in some way, you know, not, they don't belong to this community, which is now beginning to kind of crystallize. But it's a very much a process in development. I think if we extended this in Bangladesh, which I'd love to do someday, is to read it forward, you know, into the 70s, into the 80s, you might get an even better picture of this. I mean, I'm kind of taking a snapshot of it, but I think it's a community, as you're kind of hinting at, in formation here.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, as you pointed out again, you know, like the infrastructure sort of overlapping with travel infrastructure, which is directly pointed at not locals, you know, so hotels as being the sites of these places is just so interesting and evocative. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if I just say that, I mean, I put it in the paper because I just find it really interesting that, you know, house prices go up and, you know, traffic gets worse. And then you realize, oh, well, this is kind of what what we're used to when we talk about the aid industry in the 21st century. Is this, you know, I mean, I love Lisa Smurl's book, Spaces of Aid, just because it's so good at describing this. And then that was one of my inspirations to go back and dig through and see what I could find. And here you're definitely seeing that, exactly that kind of those movements of people. I mean, the other thing which I should have just mentioned there is because the aid workers don't stay very long, a lot of them, they're coming in for short tours, they're parts of medical teams that are there for, let's say, 6 months, they move back out again. That reinforces the liminality because they come in and they are looking to lock directly into the networks that already exist. They move into the houses that are already there. And then that kind of, you know, the fact that you're not going to be there maybe for that long, unless you're like a field director or something, then that I think reinforces that sense of people on the move or not really having any roots.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about mobility and the spaces that mobility creates in these contexts. What I found really fascinating in your talk is how you really, like in a very structured way, you refer to different layers of mobility that constitute this aid land, like the physical dimension of the aid industry. But apart from that, which all happens in kind of this politically opportune built environment and in physical proximity to government and diplomacy, you also talk about the transfer of knowledge and the role of expertise and technology, which is all sort of part of this mobility, I guess, pattern. And then you also refer to the aid workers as really being stuck between this sense of community and the sense of dislocation, so people in motion. Now, what I would be really interested in, like talking about a little bit, is how these different scales of mobility, physical, conceptual, emotional, relate to each other, and whether there's sort of hierarchies to these scales that you would see.
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually, Till, because I should have said actually at the outset that this project, or this also comes from a project which was run by Kiran Patel in Munich and Sonia Levson in Freiburg on trying to map contours of social movements and social activism in the 1970s. So I got the invite from them to talk about something to do with aid in a European context, and that gave me the inspiration to think about those spaces. So the three spaces you've identified, the kind of physical, conceptual, and emotional. We were all, I mean, there's a group of 6 of us we're trying to think about that in that way, about how these activists actually moved. And I think it's really interesting. To me, I mean, to me, all three are interconnected in the sense that they can reinforce themselves. And I think one of the keys to actually answering your question is the fact that they remain connected to home in a really interesting way. In some ways, their physical presence in the field dislocates them. So you see a lot of criticism of being told what to do from headquarters, whether it's Oxfam or Save the Children, whoever it is. Like, we know better because we're separated from, and the community, actually, to go back and Jessica, to your question, is being created through that as well. So that sense of kind of emotional connection, Till, as you're hinting at, is being created in the sense of separateness that we belong in the field here. And therefore we're kind of learning as we go. We've taken these technologies out, some of them don't work, and we're trying to figure out what we're doing, and therefore we have expertise. I mean, I didn't put the quote in the paper, but Raymond Cournoyer actually just writes back to Oxfam Canada at one point and says, look, just give us the money and we'll send you back any publicity you need, but effectively leave us alone because we know what to do, and we're sharing kind of ideas between us, and we're all living in the same space. So I think they are connected like that in some ways. So the emotional is coming from that kind of physical dislocation. And yet at the same time, that kind of connection to home remains open, and it creates an expectation of what you are embodying. So the emotional sense of a community is also coming from the idea that donors are living vicariously through you, and that you are almost, expected to live up to certain expectations. So Anne-Micah Fector in Sussex has written brilliantly about this, and there's a whole raft of work to be done, by the way, because I can feel the gap in my work on gender dynamics in this, and I just couldn't get to it really in what I was reading. I just couldn't figure out how to piece that together. You were getting glimpses of it, but I think that's probably telling me something very strongly about what's missing here. And I'd like to figure out who was at, for example, the Nigerian Nights, and whether that's part of it. But I think that kind of sense of, we are carrying that kind of emotional connection to home. We are an extension of certain types of community, whether that's a national. I mean, that's particularly strong for the Irish. It's written as a kind of an extension of Irish. Of the Irish kind of mission, if you like. I hesitate to use that word, but it actually is really appropriate because it's seen as a continuation of Christian mission. And then I think the three of them knit together through that, as you said, the conceptual space. So it's that sense of that reinforces the dislocation, actually, because it privileges certain forms of knowledge. Now, what's really interesting in that context is that I read a lot of the British and Canadian and Irish government papers on this, and what you get from them is the Indian government, for example, in the refugee case, really knows what it's doing, because it's dealt with refugees on a number of occasions before. It has a really efficient system. Now, when you read the NGO documents, you don't really get that as much because they're privileging certain types of expertise. And so I think the three of them kind of tend to intertwine, but that one is actually really, really important because they come with that sense of, in my book, I call it kind of a humanitarian modernity. And I'm borrowing a little bit from Tom Scott-Smith and Joel Glassman, both of whom wrote brilliant books last year on this broad topic. But, that idea that you privilege these new technologies or this sense of modernity. I mean, it's amazing in this context how many of them just don't work, and how much experimentation they do. I'm really fascinated by that. That's why I had to put up that image on the slide of the Porton jet injector. It just doesn't work. It's an idea of injecting 1,000 people an hour, but once you get dust into it, or you try and I mean, we know too much about vaccination now, right? But the image I had in my head as I was writing this was, because I wrote it just before COVID, but since the pandemic, just thinking about vaccination programs, they had the idea that you could line 1,000 people past this machine in an hour and vaccinate them all, but like physically to get people to move was impossible. So that kind of privileging of that kind of knowledge and that detail, I think, knits all those things together because they're experiencing that. And then just to give a very brief, just to finish, anecdote that I saw was that the idea that, we have local doctors here, and it goes back to your question as well, Nesca, but we have local doctors here, but they're not trained enough to use this new machine. And I that was very definitely the case. Now, they could be trained up, but that then reinforces that hierarchy, within it. So I think all three spaces are actually inherently interlinked because they tend to reinforce each other. But I think that for me, that window that exists to home is actually really important. That your series, to focus on mobility is a great way of talking about this, because to me, while some of them stay for a long time, most of them are moving in and out of this space all the time. And therefore, they're bringing those ideas in with them all the time, and they tend to be separate from home. And that fact that they're now all being trained in development studies, and they tend to be doing that kind of form of training, and it's accelerating, is really critical then in reinforcing those linkages.
Speaking of the movement of knowledge of concepts, I think, also in your book, I think a really important aspect of your work is, well, the critical analysis of the globalization of compassion. And the way I understood, you foreground compassion in a way sort of through the prism of this classical Western kind of concern for distant others that really requires unmasking through critical analysis of global inequalities, of colonial legacies, etc. But you also focus on this specific historical period as really having created something new out of these legacies. And perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on what role compassion played in this context and how ideas of compassion really also transformed in this particular time span.
That's a really, really great question, Till, actually, yeah, because I spent so long trying to figure out what the best word was. And I stuck with humanitarianism for a long time. And I have to actually thank the reviewers of the first, when I sent the proposal in with 2 chapters to Cambridge, and they came back and one of them said, just a little bit unsettled by the use of humanitarian here. It doesn't seem to work, you know, and I think what they triggered in my head was, you're stretching that label too far and it's going to lose its usefulness. And then I kind of went back to Haskell and some of those ideas of a broader compassion. And because the more I read and the more I started to write it, actually, really, the more I realized that the people work across human rights, global justice, humanitarianism, emergency relief, all these different spaces. And I think in this moment, there are two things happen that make it distinct, right? One is, I mentioned this in the paper a little bit, but it's really the focal point of the book, that I see this as a kind of an acceleration process. I don't see it as distinct. I mean, I'm very reluctant to call things turning points, because I think you never lose the baggage of everything that's come before. And I think that post 1960 kind of post-independence period in the, I mean, I call it the third world in the book because that's what all of my protagonists do, use that phrase, and never use the phrase the global south. I don't like the phrase developing world, so if you'll excuse me using third world in this context, but I think that changes the environment, and you get this acceleration of processes where you get people moving from those older forms of missionary or colonial officers or military officers often into this new world. And so they're recreating a relationship and an encounter and an intervention model in the third world in a different way. And actually Bangladesh is absolutely crucial for that, because I mean, what I describe in the book is how they actually create a new kind of compassionate space in that context. I mean, the reason Bangladesh is so important is because, for example, Irish NGOs had no relationship to that space. You know, they had no missionaries there, you know, or very, very, very few. So it's the idea that you could create a narrative of intervention anywhere in the world, I think is what's happening here. And that community is really important in that. The second reason I picked compassion is because it helps us to understand the fact that the sector, the NGO sector works, it's successful because of its ability to absorb a broad spectrum of ideas and meanings of compassion. So it very much is a very, very clever movement itself, because it manages to say, you know, if you're for emergency relief or traditional forms of charity, that's okay, we do that. And actually Oxfam UK is the perfect example of an organization that manages to do all of this. So it says, you know, okay, you want to do traditional kind of charity, that's okay, we do that. But you want to do human rights, actually we're going to move in that direction as well. And there's a space for you to latch on to our campaigns, let's say in El Salvador in the early 1980s. Or you're interested in global justice issues. Well, actually, we're becoming interested in fair trade and particularly new international economic order, as I describe in the book. And then once you scale that up from one organization, you see an entire sector that diversifies and pulls in all of those viewpoints and allows itself to, I mean, I describe it as a movement deliberately because it looks to me like like the way we would think of a definition of a social movement, which broadly shares the same idea of compassion, and as you said, kind of that kind of compassionate intervention in the third world or the global south, but which allows this kind of convergence of opinions and differences as to how that should actually be achieved. And I think that's the real difference that I see, and it's one of the things I think it becomes a catalyst for allowing the sector to become so big, is that it manages in this for lots of reasons, which I probably could talk for about 2 hours about, but for lots of reasons it manages to do that, and manages to capture all these spaces and become a focal point for that.
You've actually just started answering the question that I was going to ask, which is about that context in which NGOs operated within the broader aid industry at the time. So aid NGOs, as you mentioned, work alongside, state and multilateral development agencies like USAID and UNDP, but also sharing that marketplace of compassion with human rights NGOs like Amnesty that are developing right at the same time, as well as the missionaries, as well as the development volunteers like the Peace Corps. So there is that broader context, but you call this the NGO moment. So I was wondering if you could explain to us what you think is the particular significance of NGOs within that broader habitat of aid and development and humanitarianism that led you to make that claim, to dub it the NGO moment.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. Why did you give the book this name? And I think I think there's actually two different ways of answering that. The first one, actually, just if I can just go back to something which you've just mentioned, which is about their relationship to. No, actually, it'd be better if I answered it the other way around. I think there's a shift that happens in politics and in the way people understand political action. And I'm obviously heavily influenced by having worked as a postdoc in the University of Birmingham with Matthew Hilton at the end of the project, which produced that brilliant book, The Politics of Expertise, about modern Britain, which described a new way of actually enacting politics, which was a shift towards non-governmental organizations. And the more, my book looks at Ireland, Britain, and Canada as a way of kind of just getting a broad spectrum within the kind of, still within the Anglophone world, but of action. And the more I looked at it, the more that pattern seemed to repeat itself in all of those different polities, that there's a change that happens from probably around the early to mid 60s onwards, but accelerates after 68, where you're getting people engaging in different ways with what they perceive as political action, probably with a small p, really. They're moving towards that kind of different forms of movement action, or being engaged with different sorts of campaigning. And as you say, this is a period of huge growth of non-governmental organizations in human rights, but particularly in the environmental movement, actually, as well. Greenpeace is 71, Friends of the Earth 69. So you're getting this change in politics. And I think that just changes people's conversation about what political action can be. And on that, I end the book by talking about a huge challenge to the sector, which comes when that goes to what I call populist humanitarianism in the mid-80s with Live Aid, and something which the NGOs are so frightened of because they can't even control that, because that is so way beyond their constituency, which has until that moment been mainly middle class, left-leaning Christians and students, and they see that as a kind of a critical group and try and kind of cultivate them. But I think that political shift is really important. But that's the below and the bottom-up story. I actually think that you cannot understand it without the other thing which you mentioned, which is the change from above in the development industry itself. And I think the two things coming together are critical, and they're very hard to separate, actually. I think, there is a change in thinking at the OECD, and particularly at the World Bank, actually, in terms of what development should be. They've kind of realized by the late 60s that the first UN development decade is a total failure, that big industrial projects like building dams are not really bringing growth. And the two kind of key shifts then happen when Robert McNamara becomes president of the World Bank, and they move towards a kind of the idea of kind of poverty alleviation through basic needs. That is absolutely crucial to my narrative anyway, because then you get a top-down model which looks a lot more like it should include NGOs, and that you cannot not include them. In that chapter of the book, I talk about how the NGOs immediately realize that, actually, and they say, if the World Bank is serious about this, then we have to do the job. And then once they see that, then they kind of see as well, actually, that's a way for us to get money to do our projects. And so then they become part of the system, you know, and it's a much bigger story because the Canadians, for example, start giving aid to NGOs, official aid from the late 60s, from 1968. And then the British, the Irish, and the European communities start in the mid 70s, just after the World Bank. So there's a change in thinking about what development could be. And then that ripples, as that ripple kind of moves outwards, and you get all these different programs which begin to include them because they're seen as a way of, I think there's two things. One, I do believe that the official aid agencies see this as a more, to use a horrible word, efficient way of delivering aid, that they can reach communities in ways which they couldn't before. But it also goes hand in hand with a change in how you see, you know, how you see intervention and what kind of global economy you want to build. Because obviously, if the bank's idea was to build, you know, to lift people out of poverty and make them mini capitalists effectively, right? So NGOs become a really good way of doing that. And because the nature of their work, you know, at that level, and the fact that they kind of, you know, they are doing that work, they get co-opted into the system. The same thing happens actually at international level in emergency relief in the late 70s, early 1980s, where you get a number of reviews at the UN of the need to coordinate international action. And specifically Cambodia is really important for that. I mean, I write in the book about how Cambodia effectively accords international legitimacy on NGOs, because it's the moment where, you know, the UN does a review of its operations. Now, you might say the UN still is not very coordinated in emergency relief, and that the international, but this is a moment where they say, actually, we need to figure out how we do this and stop this overlapping. And the NGOs just happen to be there as well. And so the way I kind of would think about it is that at the beginning of my period in Biafra, the NGOs are a bottom-up, very much a kind of a popular thing, but that they're assisted in that case by the fact that the governments of the third world open the doors for them and allow them in and tell them what spaces. And it's the same actually in Bangladesh and India. And then you get all of those international agencies opening doors that allow and create a space for NGOs to flourish in. So it's a top-down and a bottom-up thing happening at the exact same time. And I think that's why I've called it the NGO moment, because it's almost like you get this huge flowering of a different type of politics, but also a space in which they can actually flourish. Because I think if we did a counterfactual and you said, well, states had decided that this wasn't an appropriate form of action, they could have kind of closed or at least put fences around that space. But in the same way as it happened in human rights, they were allowed to flourish and then they were co-opted into a system.
I think the way you show this constant change, also in relation to Aidland, is really a very, very strong point in your work. And I have to admit, as an anthropologist, I was initially critical of, you know, like the employment of the term Aidland, because there has been quite a bit of controversy in the discipline, with Elizabeth Harrison basically sort of saying this is kind of a static Western exceptionalism to focus on this. But I have to admit, like, reading through your historical analysis, it convinced me. That this is really useful to look at it this way. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit, just to because I'm really curious, and I believe because there will be many anthropologists in our audience who might also be interested in that. Now, sort of the issue of Western exceptionalism, I think, persists to some extent if we focus on Aidland and largely Western aid workers. I think one thing I would like to talk about is, because you have such a strong analysis of historical change in this area, I think a point that really interests me is to what extent you see similarities or differences in the emergence of, you know, non-Western aid lands. If we think historically, right, socialist spaces, there's a bit of really research emerging on that part of aid history. But then also, if we think about the present, with respect to aid coming from China or the Gulf, what are the dynamics there? I know you're not an expert on these developments, but I'm sure there would be really interesting comparative case studies that one can employ to kind of see what different kinds of aid lands might emerge.
That's a really brilliant question, actually, Till. And I read through a lot of that material actually as well of the critique of Aidland, because coming at it as an historian initially as well, I mean, I shared some of that skepticism because I found it a little bit static, and I mean, as in it in some ways it can be a little bit reductivist, in the sense of trying to kind of create a model which describes different locations and different contexts. And it's one of the reasons I stressed in the talk that, and I kind of stressed this in the book as well, that most of this stuff remains contextual. You need to actually understand the dynamics of the places that we're talking about, because, for example, South Asia creates a totally different dynamic than I would have seen in El Salvador, for example. And I think that isn't really important, that we can't simply, I think it's what you're kind of hinting at partly. I mean, it's one element of it. We come to the Western exceptionalism because I think it's really other important, but it is a sense that there's you cannot describe the different contexts in exactly the same ways. That the infrastructure is not the same. The degree to which they map onto colonial networks in South Asia is, because they were well developed, and because the kind of pathways already existed, it's different. For example, yeah, as I said, Central America or Cambodia or let's say Ethiopia in the 1980s, it just looks different. And I think we really need to be cognizant of that. And that's why when I was applying it, I was kind of conscious of trying to get that sense of a kind of historical development of it. And just reversing all the way back, Agnieszka, to your first question, I think that kind of sense of an emerging community to me, and it's something which it still is in flux, is something I wanted to get across in the paper, because I think I still kind of think that what I'm describing here is not quite an Aidland which has set boundaries, but something which remains kind of fluid. And I'm very conscious of that in both ways, Till, that I'm describing a very much an Anglophone grouping here, and that they, exist alongside other interventions and other forms, as you said, of Aidland. In this case, what's actually really interesting is that the move into Bangladesh, and again, this kind of goes back to the previous question too, the move into Bangladesh and their role in trying to build a new Bangladeshi state is partly a reaction to the possibility of intervention from the Eastern Bloc. So there's a really interesting Cold War dynamic there, which I didn't really bring out, but which I talk about a little bit in the article that this is partly based on. But that the World Bank very much is funding a lot of this, and that you're getting this kind of emergence of an attempt to get in there first to hold Bangladesh in the Western orbit, by pumping all this kind of money into its development, by allowing all these new development projects, and by engaging NGOs in that process. And so it's in that sense, it keeps it within the Western sphere. And so what you see is that model. But you're absolutely right that this is, it's problematic just to kind of assume that this is the globalized kind of model. Now, my argument is that at this moment you have competing different forms of Aidland. And I think particularly in those few decades after the Second World War, you very definitely have all these alternative models. And you see that very prominently actually in Cambodia, where you have lots of intervention from the Eastern Bloc in Europe, but also you have heavy Chinese influence there as well in terms of the model of intervention. And it's only in the Cambodian case is so complicated because certain NGOs work within Cambodia and others work within Thailand. So it creates different types of Aidland where the parameters of are dictated by certain forms. I think the other answer to your question is actually about local organizations. And obviously in the Bangladesh case, you have BRAC, which becomes this huge NGO. It's very, very prominent NGO that is still extremely prominent and is seen as an example of an indigenous organization. And it is emerging at this point in Bangladesh, and is starting to kind of ask different questions. And again, it's the reason why I definitely see the borders of my kind of case as fluid, because you also have, and I do mention this in the paper, but you have different forms of connection with local groupings. So if you're a Christian group, you tend to work through the local churches a lot more than if you are kind of a secular NGO. And so the borders are a little bit blurred. the thing I would say though is that when I called the book The Globalization of Compassion, I was conscious of those alternative aid lands, but I think in the longer run, it's actually the Western model that wins out in the end to a large extent. And I'm not saying exclusively, because I have been at lots and lots and lots of discussions in the last few years about localization and about the need to decolonize the industry, and the kind of the fact that you do have these very strong indigenous organizations. But I think on balance, what you see is that the predominant model is this one. And again, I'm not others kind of do exist, and they filter in and out, and maybe that, reversing back to what we started talking about with this question, is that's what makes me slightly uneasy about Aidland, is just the idea that you have one model and you can supplant it elsewhere. I think it's useful if you allow that context and you allow that historical understanding in. But I think you're right. I mean, there are multiple aid lands. My sense is that the one that I'm describing here is the one which tends to dominate and which tends to predominate and which tends to create that hierarchy as well, where the others are slightly marginalized. But the last thing I would say on that, and I think this is crucial, and it's an argument I made in the book quite strongly, is I think sometimes historians have been too quick to forget about the agency of state actors from the global south in creating this entire sector. So, I mean, in the case of refugees coming into India, at one point in July 1971, the Indian government, in an attempt to kind of control the nature of the emergency, just expelled all foreign aid workers. And so, like, you can't understand Aidland then without actually saying, well, you know, the power still lies in that context. And the same in Bangladesh. I mean, the Bangladeshi government, you know, kept some control over who could enter, when they could enter, what kind of jobs they could do. And so that, I think we've been too quick to kind of reduce that form of agency, even if the people who are on the receiving end of aid are, you know, maybe we're right to say that they maybe have reduced agency, but states often have a lot of agency in dictating where and how these NGOs can actually work.
We're getting pretty close to needing to wrap up, but just as you were speaking, I was wondering about whether that sort of power of Aidland or strength of Aidland is also could be measured by personal relationships. So who, in your talk, you spoke of romantic relationships, you know, marriages between NGO staff and Bangladeshi staff. But if that was another sort of aspect through which you could pick at, you know, both the separation between Western aid workers and local communities, but also, you know, how hard aid workers had to work to forge genuine friendships or relationships outside of their aid land, and whether that could sort of be a key in the different contexts to sort of understanding that separation and understanding the difference.
Yeah, this is this great question, and yes, and I think, like, obviously from your work as well on volunteers, you know, like the kind of the great project to do would be to try and map who comes from where they work and where they end up. And it's, I mean, it would be a ginormous project, I think, but it's something I would love to do, is to try and trace, I mean, in my case, beyond this little case study where I get glimpses of that, but actually if we did some really interesting kind of life stories of some of these aid workers and followed through, you know, that sense of, okay, well, did they remain? Because what I often found was that, so Julian Francis, who was Oxfam's field director, I quoted him, but from an article which he's written from Bangladesh in, you know, in I think the last couple of years, because he's obviously remained, and some of them remain there. And so you get some who do stay and do kind of break down those kind of boundaries. But I think the only way to get at that would be a much longer term project which actually focused on their lives. And it's something which I'd love to do, and which I've been chatting to Anna Bocking-Welch actually in the University of Liverpool about doing something on this. And the problem is the scale of it is huge. You know, if you know, to try and kind of figure out, because there's all sorts of different dimensions. There's the one you mentioned, which is their relationship to locals and how they relate to them, and the everyday of that, which is something which I'm a little bit frustrated I couldn't really get to properly in the case study. The other one which I'd be really interested in, which comes back to questions you've both asked already, which is of the creation of a community which now allows aid workers to move between different organizations a lot. And So I think that might be interesting to see, where do people work, who do they work for, and how does that actually affect their relationship to local communities. But it's a terrific question. I mean, I think it would require kind of projecting forward and actually maybe going back as well, because you often find that people like Raymond Cornoyer, who's the Oxfam Canada person on the ground, had been there before. He'd been a missionary in South Asia. He knew the territory, had been a teacher there actually, and then comes back to do this work. So I think that would uncover a lot of. I hope I'm talking someone else into doing this project, because I'd love to read it, because I think it would be so massive to do. But I think it would actually be really, really, really helpful to actually historicize those relationships, and it would break down some of the Aidland question that you're asking, Till, I think as well, by actually just chipping away at some of the boundaries of this, like who came into those hotels, who came into the rooms, what was the relationship like, even to local staff. I mean, I just couldn't get to that in the material I read, which was as much as I could read, because I was reading government documents, NGO documents, I interviewed people, but you still only get glimpses of that, and I think that's definitely a next step to do a really big project on thinking about that, and doing it more broadly than my grouping as well, because I think it would be interesting to allow a lot of other kind of voices in.
Absolutely. Kevin O'Sullivan, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for your time. You have sparked so many ideas, hopefully future projects. So hopefully we can keep this conversation going for much longer than just this time.
And thanks so much, guys. It's a really, really brilliant conversation, and it's so nice to kind of talk about this work with this lens. I mean, I really love the interdisciplinary nature of this conversation as well, because I think that it was only by reading the ethnography and the anthropology that it unlocked how to think about this. So I think the series is brilliant for that too, like that you're kind of opening up the opportunity to think about these things, and things which inherently need to be thought of in that way, because it's not possible for us to stay in our silos. So thanks very much. Yeah, it's a really great way to start my morning anyway, with a discussion like this.